between Yosef and Yehuda. Yosef is the leader of Egypt. He's the viceroy, or whatever you want to call it, the man with all the power, and he just pulled a fast one on Yehuda, and he planted the goblets in Yosef's in Binyamin's sack, and all of their plans are going up in smoke, and the whole future of the Jewish people seems to be ruined. It's a real tense time. And Vayigash Elav Yehuda, as you can see, it starts on verse 18, meaning it's in the middle of a chapter. The conversation started even earlier. Yosef was giving it to them. If you look back in the previous parsha, at the end of Miketz, in again chapter 44, verse 15, Vayomer lahem Yosef, ma ma'aseh zeh asher asitem. Yosef is telling him off. What is this deed that you have done? Do you not realize that a man like me would figure it out? Nachesh nachesh, divine. Actually, just before Vayigash, in Pasuk Tet Zayin, so already Yehuda is Vayomer Yehuda. Ma nomar laduni, what can I say? Ma nedaber mitzdadak, how can we justify ourselves? Elohim matzah et avon avadecha, hinenu avodim laduni. We're all going to be servants, we'll be slaves to the Lord, and us together with Binyamin, who had the Gaviyah. And in verse 17, Yosef answers, Vayomer Chalila Lila. So I can't do that. That would be wrong. Only the man with the goblet, meaning Binyamin, he'll be my slave. The rest of you, go up in peace to your father. And then the beginning of the parsha is Vayigash Elav Yehuda. And Yehuda, there's a preface. It doesn't just continue the conversation. There's back and forth. Yosef spoke, Yehuda answered. Yosef answered. We would expect the continuation of the conversation. Yehuda said, XYZ, no. And rightly so, our tradition has at the beginning of the next parsha, Vayigash Elav Yehuda. Judah approached him. So this approaching Yosef is the beginning of a new conversation. It's a new approach to the conversation. And it's a new approach to Yosef, which is, and you've probably spoke about it last week in the Parsha class, many different ways to interpreting what was the tack, what was the approach that Yehuda was taking with Yosef. What have you heard in terms of interpretations? How was Yehuda approaching Yosef? What did you learn when you learned the Parsha last week? Vayigash Elav Yehuda. What was Yehuda's approach? What was his attitude to Yosef?
So that he displayed himself as a servant, he and also his father.
He was being humble.
Yeah,
he was being humble. He says many times. Any other approaches other than Yehuda was coming to be humble himself? He does say, you know, I'm your servant, my master.
He has a detail about that he cannot leave Benjamin in Egypt, for that would be like the death of his father. Like he got very much detail.
So there's a lot of details.
So the whole story basically.
And but what does that have to do with anything? That his father, can't be left?
That, also that he that his father had two sons. Like he mentions Yosef and Benjamin as his
right.
sons,
Okay. Yeah. Yehuda coming to approach Yosef. Yehuda and Yosef are, of course, the sons of Rachel and the sons of Leah. Seems like it's an encounter head to head. And in many commentaries, they seem to look at it not so much that he's saying, although the words say, I am your servant, he's actually coming, and this is a confrontation. There's hidden in Chazal, you see that there's hidden hints to the fact that maybe Yehuda is saying, you better release us or else, or you release Binyamin or else. There's a hidden threat that Yehuda is actually going to attack and rebel against Yosef. And so there's many different ways of reading this encounter between Yosef and one of the things David mentioned also, he mentions, oh, my poor father is going to die. So you could say the approach is one of a sob story, excuse the language, right? He's asking for pity. He's begging. Not just that he's being very humble, but he's asking, he's appealing to Yosef's emotions. Many different ways to read this conversation, this back and forth. I want to introduce you to a different interpretation, which I wrote up once somewhere. I have to find it where it is, but I think it's quite true to the text. And I want to show you this, how to read this conversation between Yosef and Yehuda, putting it in the larger context of how many conversations do we actually have in the Torah, which are, back and forth. The Torah many times is narrative, many times there's laws, and here and there there's actually dialogues. So the other dialogue, which I want to compare it to, is the dialogue which is a few parshas before that, when Yaakov, the father, is about to, he's living with Lavan, and he decides to leave, and he starts to run away. Take a look. Please open up to the book of Bereshit, in Parshat Vayetze, chapter 31. We'll start from the beginning of the chapter. In chapter 31, at the beginning, it's Parshat Vayetze, you see Bereshit Lamed Aleph. So maybe someone could read for me. Dave, will you read for me? In English, please. Yeah, read in English first. Chapter 31, verse 1.
Then they heard the word. Then he heard the
You were talking about Yaakov, yeah.
Okay. Then he heard the words of Laban's son, saying, Yaakov has taken all that belonged to our father, and from that which belonged to our father he amassed all his wealth. Yaakov also noticed Laban's disposition, that behold, it was not toward him as in earlier days. And Hashem said to Yaakov, return to the land of your fathers and to your native land, and I will be with you.
Okay, so who's speaking up till now? Verse 1, 2, and 3?
The sons of Laban.
This is the narrator. He's telling us what happened. Yaakov heard this. God told him that. Right? He heard from them. And that's all a setup for what happens now in verse 4. Verse 4 is the beginning of a fascinating encounter. It's a dialogue, not between Yehuda and Yosef, but between who? Yaakov and Rachel and Leah. Yaakov and his wives. It's a conversation between, in the family. We don't have so many conversations between husbands and wives in the Torah. We have, Rachel yelling at Yaakov, give me a son. We have Sarah getting angry at Abraham. But a conversation like this, where we have an internal conversation between a husband and wife, they're very few and far between. So this is a very interesting conversation to listen in on. Okay, so we're in chapter 31, verse 4. Go ahead. Jacob sent
and summoned Rachel and Leah to the field to his flock, and said to them, I have noticed that your father's disposition is not toward me as in the earlier days, but the God of my father was with me. Now you have known that it was with all my might that I served your father. Yet your father mocked me and changed my wage 100 times. But God did not permit him to harm me. If he would stipulate, speckled ones shall be your wage, then the entire flock bore speckled ones. And if he would stipulate ringed ones shall be your wage, then the entire flock bore ringed ones. Thus God took away your father's livestock and gave them to me. It once happened at the mating time of the flock that I raised my eyes and saw in a dream, behold, the he-goat that mounted the flock were ringed, speckled, and checkered. And an angel of God said to me in a dream, Yaakov. And I said, Here I am. And he said, Raise your eyes, if you please, and see that all the he-goats mounting the flocks are ringed, speckled, and checkered. For I have seen all that Laban is doing to you. I am the God of Bet-El, where you anointed a pillar, and where you made me a vow. Now arise, leave this land, and return to your native land.
So you can see that's the end of the quotation. There's the end of a quotation. And Yaakov, it's not much of a conversation yet. He calls them out and he gives them a long speech.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a speech within there's a conversation within the speech.
Mm-hmm.
The conversation is between who?
Yaakov and the angel.
The angel, and Yaakov. He says, it once happened to me, I dreamt, and I saw this angel, and there's about the flocks, and then he says, I am the God of Bet-El, arise and leave the land. So all he does is tell them a story. He tells them a story with a story within the story. He tells them a story that at the beginning, he starts off with, I've noticed your father's disposition is not towards me. But, so he tells them the story. What do they respond? Go ahead. Verse 14.
Then Rachel and Leah replied and said to him, Have we then still a share and an inheritance in our father's house? Are we not considered by him as strangers? For he has sold us and even totally consumed our money. But all the wealth that God has taken away from our father belongs to us and to our children. So now, whatever God has said to you, do.
Okay, that's their response.
Continue?
And continue, yeah.
Jacob arose and lifted his children and his wives onto the camels. He led away all his livestock and all the wealth which he had amassed, his purchased property which he had amassed in Padad Aram, to go to his father Yitzhak, the land of Canaan.
Okay, so this is an interesting conversation. Basically, we have two sides, just two quotes. One, a long speech by Yaakov, and then a long speech by Rachel and Leah, speaking together. And then Yaakov leaves. He decides to leave. Fascinating to analyze this conversation, and I want to talk about it a little bit before we go back to try to perhaps understand Yehuda and Yosef one more time. First thing I want to point out is go back to the beginning, verse 4. Yaakov sent and summoned Rachel and Leah to the field, to his flock. Why did he do that?
Well, he was living under the roof of Laban, or at least near to him, so he wanted to have a private conversation with his wives and his children, maybe, and that's why he goes somewhere where they cannot hear him.
Good. He wanted it to be private, yeah. Secrecy, yeah, it's good. Number one, good point for a recipe, for a good conversation, it's got to be private. If you want to really be open and allow the other person to be open, you have to have privacy. You can't really get to the bottom of things or have a real conversation if you're in public. So, very good. And quickly, just before we go, I want to keep analyzing this parsha. What's the difference between Vayigash, Yehuda and Yosef?
Well, they're talking in front of all the...
This is a public
guardians.
That's right. This is in the palace. It's in front of everybody. It's not a private conversation. There, you can see a lens to interpretation that he was maybe threatening him. Maybe he was putting on a show. He was begging. This is much more a real conversation between a husband and wife, wives in this case. He says we need privacy. We need to talk just amongst ourselves. Okay, so that's number one. He summons them to the field, and then he tells them a story. He tells them, let's look at verse number 5. And he said to them, I have noticed that your father's disposition is not towards me as in earlier days, but the God of my father was with me. Now you have known that it was with all my might that I served your father. I want to teach you a very important principle when it comes to conversation, dialogue, especially when it comes to marital discussions, but it's also true in general. There's something called I sentences versus you sentences. I statements and you statements. Whenever you start off and you're having a conversation with somebody and you use you statements, it puts the other person on the defensive. You think that I should do X, Y, and Z. Or you, the other day, didn't do the dishes when you were supposed to. Or you think that you can be stronger than I am at this. Or you think that you could... It's an accusation. Whenever you start with the word you, whenever you start a statement with you, immediately the other person's going to be on the defensive. It's almost like an accusation, and people don't like to hear that. They feel like they're being put upon, even if it's true. You are feeling cold today. Now it's true because it's cold outside. It's true, but what are you telling me how I feel? I know how I feel. You don't know how I feel. It's almost like you're getting their back up against the wall if you start making statements about the other person. It's much better to always phrase yourself with statements about yourself. I statements. So I'm feeling cold today. Yeah, so you could play with it. Obviously, you can make it silly. Obviously. Right. I think you feel like it has to be real. No, but it's semantics, but it can be semantics, but it can also be very real. Yeah.
It's also different if you say like, I found it disturbing. Then
yes,
you say you
that's
disturbing
right.
me.
Exactly.
Like,
exactly. You're disturbing me.
I
feel. You're talking about yourself. How I feel. Yeah. Now, obviously, how I feel is a response to something about you, something that you did or something that you said. But you can't argue when I say this is the way I feel. Right? You can't argue about emotions.
If I start the conversation with I open myself up.
That's right. That's right. That's right. So I statements, we see that Yaakov is doing that right here. He tells about himself. He says, I noticed, and he's not talking about them, he's talking about his, their father, but I noticed that I was being, and he starts talking about I served him with all my might, and I worked very hard, and then he starts talking about what happened to him. He never once, if you notice, if you once again look at the entire paragraph, he never once asks them for anything. He doesn't say, hey, let's go back to Canaan, let's leave, let's run away. He doesn't say, what am I going to do here? I feel uncomfortable. He talks about himself. He does say that I feel uncomfortable. And then he tells them about this conversation he had, another conversation he had with the angel, and how God told him. He doesn't say it explicitly, and then, well, because the angel came and told me to go back and return to your native land, now I'm turning to you, and I'm asking you, let's go. I want to go. Now, in the ancient world, this type of I don't think that the husband actually needed permission even. There's a rule that if Yaakov decided to leave, and he needed to leave because of his parnasa, because of his livelihood, whatever it is, the wife wouldn't really have much choice. He didn't have to have this conversation at all. The very fact that he's having a conversation with them is already showing that he's caring for them and showing some sensitivity to that. They're just not going to want to leave their family home just like that. Maybe there's something that we should talk about it. And then even when he talks to them, he doesn't press on them. He doesn't push on them. First of all, he talks about himself, how he's feeling regarding the workers, regarding the feeling of his father-in-law. And then he tells them the story, what else happened to him. Funny thing happened to me at work today, honey. Right? What a funny thing to happen. I had a conversation with an angel. I had a dream. I got tips, insider trading from an angel about which types of flocks are going to have more babies. I've been having this. So he talks about himself. And he doesn't even make a direct request of them. He doesn't even say to them. He just tells them the story. Tells them the story. And what happens afterwards? They obviously get the hint. They realize what this means for them, what it means, and the issue that he's raising. And the issue that he's raising is, can we leave? Should we leave? On the one hand, this is your home, this is your father. And on the other hand, God, an angel of God came, it seems like some kind of a prophecy, told me that now it's time to leave and go back to the land of Canaan. And they responded to both. They respond, and their response says, have we a share and inheritance in our father's house? We're not considered by him as strangers. So we don't consider ourselves close to our father anymore. And then regarding the second part about this prophecy, all the wealth that God has taken, again, they say that God has taken it from our father, belongs to us and our children. Whatever God has said to you, do. So they respond in kind. And again, they speak about themselves. They don't say, well, you should do this because God told you to do it. Of course you have to do it. They speak in I statements. Amazing conversation between Rachel and Leah and Yaakov, their husband. Okay, so far so good. So we learned some principles of we have to practice it. We have to practice that. I don't know if we'll have time right now because I want to show you the parallel in Vayigash. I actually plan to have a practice session of Vayigash, but maybe next time we'll do a practice session of having practice conversations. I'm not feeling 100%, so we'll leave that for the exercise for the next time. But I want to contrast this now and compare and contrast with Parshat Vayigash. Okay, so let's go back to Parshat Vayigash. How does this conversation go? Again, we're in the middle of a conversation already. Yosef is telling Yehuda, yelling at him really, telling him off for stealing the goblet. Yehuda has totally given in. He says, you're right, what can I do? God found our weak point. And then, at the beginning of Vayigash, Yehuda decides to try again. Even though his first plea was that we all be servants was rejected. It's chapter 44, verse 18. Yehuda decides to try again. He says, if you please, Vayomer bi Adoni, if you please, may your servant speak a word in my Lord's ears, not let your anger flare up at your servant. So let's read this, basically Yehuda's speech. And I want you to notice a few things about the speech along the lines of what we were saying in the previous conversation that we had. First of all, Vayigash elav. Yehuda approached him. We know that this is in public. This is not the most conducive place to have a heart-to-heart. But with all the differences, let's try to listen to Yehuda's speech with these new ears that we just are learning. Okay? Who can read it for me? In English? Who can read it for me? From the top of Vayigash. Shushan, will you read for me, please? Yeah.
Then Yehuda approached him and said, if you please, my lord, may your servant speak a word. My lord says, let not your anger flare up at your servant, for you are like Pharaoh. My lord has asked his servant, saying, have you a father or brother? And we said to my lord, we have an old father and a young child of his old age. His brother is dead, he is left, for his mother and his father loves him. you said to your servants, bring him down to me, and I will set my eye on him. We said to my Lord, the youth cannot leave his father, for should he leave his father, he will die. But you said to your servants, if your youngest brother does not come down with you, you will not see my face again. Further?
Mhm.
And it was when we went up to your servant, my father, we told him my Lord's words, and your father said, go back, buy us some food. We said, we cannot go down, only if your youngest brother is with us. Then we will go down, for we cannot see the man's face if our youngest brother is not with us. Then your servant, my father, said to us, you know that my wife bore me 2 sons. One has left me, and I presume, alas, he has surely been torn to pieces, for I have not seen him since. So should you take this one too from my present, and disaster befall him, then you will have brought down my hoariness in evil and the grave. And now, if I come to your servant, my father, and the youth will not with us, since his soul is bound up with his soul, it will happen that he see the youth is missing, he will die, and your servants will have brought down the hoariness of your servant, our father, in sorrow to the grave. For your servant took responsibility for the youth from my father, saying, if I do not bring him back to you, then I will have sinned to my father for all time. Now therefore please let your servants remain instead of the youth as the servant to my Lord, and let the youth go up with his brothers. For how can I go up with my father if the youth is not with me, lest I see the evil that will befall my father?
Yefa. So that's quite a long speech. How many verses? Wow. From 18 till 34. That's one long speech. What did you notice? What did you notice about Yehuda's speech?
It's differently to the what we read before. It's saying you all the whole time.
There's a lot of you. Okay.
Yeah. So
Okay.
may your servant speak up in a word of my Lord is, and he talks to him in the third person.
Okay, good. What else?
Basically, he tells again what Joseph told him to do. Like he tells the whole story. Like he says, "This is what you told me to do. This is what you told us to do. You ask us for this. You ask for this." Like he said again, Sean said, like a lot of use.
Is it in any way similar to what Yaakov said to his wives? Remember, Yaakov gave a whole long speech to his wives.
The wife is the Laban. I mean, your father.
Okay.
It's about the father.
It's about the father. Here too, it's about his father. That's good. That's good. Okay, so I want to say a few things. First of all, I think that the introduction, Vayigash Elav Yehuda, I believe Yehuda was trying to separate himself off from the court, from the wider picture, almost like Yaakov took his wives out to the field to try to have a little bit more of a private conversation. Even though it might have been impossible, they were in the court, but it's different from the conversation they had before. Yosef is yelling at him from the throne, saying, how dare you? And Yosef, that was the public conversation. The Vayigash Elav Yehuda, the beginning of the Parsha, it separates off this section and seems to perhaps saying he approached him perhaps in a more private and more personal approach. He's not anymore like the previous conversation, the last few psukim at the end of the previous Parsha, but he's starting a new tack. And this new tack might be a little bit more intimate, maybe like Yaakov and his wives. Now, it is true, of course, that he talks about you said, and I said, and you said, and I said. He retells the story, which is very interesting because we all know the story. We read it in the last 2 parshot. We know exactly what Yaakov said, what Yosef said, and we know what the brothers said, and we know what went back and forth. He retells the story. And then When he gets beyond retelling the story, look in verse 24. Now he tells him sections which Yosef doesn't necessarily know. And here it's all about himself. It's about him and the brothers and what was going on in their lives. It's no more, you said, you told us. These are I statements. These are I statements as well. When we went up to your servant and father, we told him my Lord's words, and our father said, we're quoting what, it's a conversation within a conversation, just like we had before. And what the father said, go back buy us food, and we said, we cannot go, only if the younger brother's with us. And my servant, your servant, my father said to us, my wife bore me too. And, if you take this one, I'll be brought to the grave. And now, verse 30, skipping ahead to 30, this is Yehuda speaking about who? Now he's speaking to Yosef. The conversation, he finished quoting, like the conversation with the angel, that Yaakov quoted to Rachel and Lavan. He quoted a conversation between the brothers and their father Yaakov. He finished the quotations. This is what we don't have over there. Over there we said, Yaakov didn't say anything. He didn't say what he wants to leave. He didn't say, okay, can we leave? Can we run away? Should we run away? He just quoted them. Here, Yehuda goes one step further. And who does he speak about? He speaks about himself. Based on all the background information I had just given you, the circumstances, the conversations we had in the past, the new section from 24 to 30 to 29, where he fills in about what's been happening in our lives, the conversation we have with our father. Now he goes on and he speaks about himself. Verse 30, and now if I come to your servant, my father, and the youth is not with us, since his soul is so bound up with his soul, it will happen that when he sees the youth is missing, he will die. And your servants, meaning us, will have brought down the ordinance of your servant, our father, in sorrow to the grave. He's speaking about what we're going to do, we the brothers. What's going to happen now is that we're going to be causing our father's death. For your servant, meaning I, took responsibility for the youth of my father, saying, if I do not bring him up. So he's talking about himself. He's just describing to him what is going to happen to me and to my father. He's not accusing Yosef of anything. He's not saying, you good for nothing, you're a tyrant, you're ruthless. And he doesn't say you're ruthless. He's just describing to you based on, first of all, he gives him the background. Almost in a neutral, objective way. He describes, you said, I said, we said. And then he fills in the extra information, the conversation that was not known, which got him thinking, which got him, which explaining what his motivation is for having this conversation, this more intimate conversation, like Yaakov pulls his wives aside, Yehuda pulls Yosef aside, and he tells him, this is the background that we all know, and the new background that I'm telling you now, the conversations we had with Yaakov. And then he talks about himself. And he says, I'm going to be causing my father's death. And I took responsibility more than the other brothers. I have even more responsibility than they do. And then finally, in verse 33, he says his practical suggestion, let your servant stay instead of your youth as a servant. And let me stay instead of Binyamin. And he finishes it up, verse 34, for how can I go up to my father if the youth is not with me? Lest I see the evil that will befall my father. It's all about himself. It's all about what's going to happen to me if you don't let me make the switch and I stay as a servant instead of Binyamin. It's almost like saying to him, imagine what my life is going to be like. I won't be able to live. I can't face going back to my father and seeing what's going on.
So he's still hinting, kind of?
There's never, he does make a direct request. He says, let me stay instead of the youth, right? Let me stay instead of Binyamin. But so there is a direct request. That's what he requested before. He says, before he actually said, well, let us all stay. And now he's saying, let me switch out my brother. So the request is there. But the major thrust of the entire plea, which Yehuda presents in many psukim, is made up of I statements. First of all, it's a retelling of the story. And speaking about what this means for me. What this means for me is I cannot see the evil that will befall my father. I just cannot. And Yosef breaks down. We know the answer. He says, okay, get everybody out. He reveals himself. Some reason this conversation with Yehuda is so powerful that it breaks Yosef down. And he doesn't get his back up. So the hinting is it's not so much that he's hinting, right? The way Chazal read it, he's hinting at war, or he's hinting at as being humble. The way I'm reading it, this is a conversation, an attempt at having a very open conversation. Like David said, when you make I statements, you open yourself up. He's speaking not about you, Yosef, and what you did to us, and what you're doing to us, and what you're going to do to my father. He's pretty much laying the situation on the table, and there's a there's a whole wisdom to when you want to negotiate something, how you sit. You know what I'm talking about? Like if I'm the boss and Hananel, right? Hananel wants to come for a raise, so he's sitting behind the desk. Like now, you're sitting the opposite side of the table, and so there's a natural power for the man who sits behind the desk, right? And that's not necessarily what you want when you're asking for something. You don't want to be powerless asking for it. So sometimes what's best to do is come with me.
Let's sit over here.
And you sit over there. You sit over here. And now we'll sit. Now there's no table between us. And
Equal.
it's more equal,
Yeah.
right? There's no big barrier. There's no division. There's no power thing here. So pulling aside, right, like Yaakov did with the wives, and what Yehuda does, Vayigash Elav Yehuda, he's changing the structure of the conversation. Also, it's not just a question of power. When it's me sitting, face me now. I'm against you like this, so I say something, you say something, you respond. It's almost like a war. We could fight. We're confrontation. But if we turn a little bit to the side, like we were just before, and so I'm still talking to you, but we're both facing something else. What are we facing?
Same direction.
Together.
More or less.
But what do we have? What is this position tell about the situation?
The middle.
We're having a conversation because we've got a problem, right? And you can deal with that problem by fighting directly, or you can realize we both have a problem. We've got a problem. The problem's over there. The problem's not me and you. We can both solve it together. We can work out a solution if we look at the problem and set it aside, not smack in the middle of where the two of us, and we're going to both be fighting, pulling, pushing, whatever it is to get more what we want out of the conversation. So many times having that conversation, just retelling the events. What you're doing is reframing the structure of the conversation so that you're not fighting with each other. You're together approaching this difficult situation. Now, this is a difficult situation. This is very high stakes. Binyamin's life, Yosef's life, Yehuda's life, Yaakov's life. There's a lot at stake here. But what's going to solve it is not necessarily the head-to-head. war or beg, which is the way we there are different interpretations for this conversation. What I'm showing is very similar to what Yaakov did with Rachel and Leah, is he's introducing a whole new way of looking at having a conversation. First of all, with the I statements, not the you statements. We're not accusatory. And second of all, the very fact that you're retelling the story from a new perspective, looking at it from the outside. And then, this is how this is going to affect me if we don't find a better solution for this problem. And so now the Yosef in this case, or the other person, he doesn't have to fight me against my solution. He can see it from his perspective. Well, how is that solution going to affect him as well? Because obviously this issue between us is going to affect all of us. But the very fact that we're not one against the other, that opens up the possibilities. Yosef ultimately breaks down and tells him that, we were never at each other. We're actually brothers. Right? We're actually brothers. Of course, we're going to be facing this together. That's the ultimate, the happy ending of the story, as we know that Yosef reveals himself. But thank you, Hanina. But I think that what we have here in these two conversations, and looking at them together, like we just did, gives us a little bit of perspective about how to have conversations in general. Whenever you have a conflict resolution, of course, when there's a conflict, but even if it's not a conflict, even when there's an issue that you're dealing with that is coming up, it doesn't have to turn into a conflict, but we learned basically two tools, or three or four tips from our little analysis of these two conversations in the book of Bereshit. Okay, who can give me some of the tips that we learned? I'm just trying to summarize here before we have to conclude. Give me one conclusion that you learned. Sorry?
I statements.
I statements versus you statements. Good. Okay, good. What else?
If you have a conversation, sit like straight to another one, not like this.
Opposite. No. The contrary.
It depends on the situation.
The contrary.
Well, let's start
But
even
you
before
understand.
that. Let's say you have an issue. Where and when should you discuss it?
Private.
So first of all, you should create the right scene, the right atmosphere, the right timing. Right, when somebody's rushing out the door, is not the time to have a serious conversation about anything. Right, when somebody's late for work or somebody's hungry or tired. Right, so set up. If this is a serious conversation that you want to accomplish something, you have to set up all the conditions so that you can actually have a successful conversation. That's principle number 2. So I statements, and then setting up the conversation and having it private. Privacy is many times absolutely possible. If you pull somebody out to the field, that's pretty private. But even if it's not, the very Vayigash Elav Yehuda, the fact that Yehuda sort of made some kind of approach, he set off the conversation from everything that was going on beforehand. Wait, let's start this over, right? Try to have the conditions ready so that the conversation is in the right framework. Okay, that's number 2. Now, number 3, the question is within that framework, how do you sit with what's the posture when you're having the conversation? So it's true about the actual sitting, like I was showing you. You could sit next to somebody, sit behind a desk, but it's also a metaphor for your approach to the issue itself. Like the way you sit shows how you're approaching the issue. Is the issue one of take and give, push and pull? Is it one in which, negotiation, we even have, like in the business, you want to pay $1,000, I want to pay $500. Right? Okay, I'll give a little bit, you give a little bit. There's a direct relationship like that. But the approach we're seeing now is that it's sometimes smarter to take the issue and put it aside and look at it from a different vantage point, where it's not just a question of what I'm getting and what you're getting, or what I want to pull or what I want to cause to happen, but you restate the problem so that it's almost like you're discussing the case objectively from outside the problem. It's not all about, in a way, Josh, in a way it's the opposite of I statements. I'm saying one thing and the opposite. I statements is all about, I'm telling you my perspective, the way I feel. It's totally about myself. At least you're not accusing the other person. That's a good stage. But the next stage I'm saying is, even take yourself out of it. It's not all about me. It's about this objective problem. It's not about you either. It's not about you or me. This is the situation. This happened. This conversation happened. You put all the facts on the table. Some you knew, some you didn't know. And now that all the facts are restated, we can both speak about it. Then we can maybe make the I statements and say, how I feel about it, what I need from this. And then, you can let the other person also see how he can deal with that. So there's these little tips on negotiation and conversation. They can be very, very useful, even with your conversations with your roommates, with your mother, with your father, when you want to ask for something for the car keys, or if you want to even just ask for a break in tuition, but even more so when it comes to like Yaakov and his wives, when it comes to having a conversation with your loved one, with your spouse. We have to be aware, if we want to have successful conversations. Both of these were successful. The results of both of them were, right? In the end, Yaakov and his wives, they agreed to leave, and they left together, even though, of course, there were issues. That it was not a simple thing. Here too, Yehuda, I can't think of a more unimaginable success beyond his greatest imagination. Yehuda's conversation was successful. In the end, he realized that there was no tyrant out to get him after all, and his father's life was never in danger, and Binyamin's life was never in danger. In the end, it was his brother, his long lost brother, who was there all along, and it was just his perspective which was not allowing him to see it. As try as he may, he could never in his wildest dreams imagine that this is the explanation for all these strange events that he said, and you said, and I said, and my father said, and here we are. It's almost like this is too much for me to really understand. But I'll put it out on the table and let's see what happens. And then what happens, of course, is the greatest revelation and redemption beyond that was even imaginable for Yehuda. So, B'ezrat Hashem, we'll try to learn from these little bits of advice that we can gain from our forefathers in terms of having successful negotiations, even successful conversations with our wives. And if we ever appear in front of the king, or if we have a conversation with a powerful man, we can learn from Yosef, from Yehuda and Yosef's conversation about that as well. Okay, we'll stop here for today.